Hello everyone, today we talk about the late Roman Empire and more specifically the interpretations of change that have been attributed to this era. We will have definitely time to discuss more in detail this period in history and both thematically or historiographically, just in part how we're going to do today. So today we will chiefly look at how later historians have interpreted this time in history and how this roughly still influences naturally our view of that period, but also in fact trying to criticize this and observe the reasons why such beliefs were built. And as you understand, this is a potentially endless topic. There is a freaking lot to tell. And it's a topic that I have particularly dear because even though I'm no expert on the late Antiquity in general, I still have, first of all, when you study the Middle Ages, at least I come from a country that when studying, when you learn medieval history at university, there is a big deal of emphasis put on late Antiquity as well. Secondly, as a medievalist, definitely there is this point of how is that the Middle Ages have begun? I've made several videos about this, obviously explaining. If you are a regular follower, you know that for me there is nothing like anything like the Middle Ages or the ancient times. It's all a ideological construct. That there is such things and never existed as such. But more than else, I just tend, I believe, naturally to observe these moments of change that I also believe were essentially moments of change, and that can be told in this fashion. Obviously, maintaining because I'm kind of betraying the ultimate sense of also what I'm going to say, because in this video we'll try to prove that there wasn't such a big change after all. At least change is definitely something that exists in every historical period. Every time is a moment of change. There are naturally, however, moments of greater or smaller change, definitely, that are also difficult to assess. It's not that you're really gonna look at every single thing that changed and try to measure that. You need a narrative, you need an interpretation. So this period being between two ages that definitely gave rise to many, mythicization, many myths, mythological interpretations, etc., like the ancient world, the Middle Ages. You realize it's important because it's partly the same base from which you have to start in order to criticize effectively this general, picture that has been drawn of this kind of stages in history that never quite existed as such. But it was a moment of change. And this change has been interpreted and spotted, since a very early age, indeed. There are many ways you can... this started fundamentally already since I would say from the same late Antiquity in some measure, even though that's not probably the best moment you can try to identify, especially in the East. But in Western Europe, the idea that there had been a previous moment when there was, something conceived as better is something you can find at least in certain sources that were naturally stressing this better on the base of the fact that they were better, as social classes, and we're talking chiefly about the senatorial elite. The senatorial elite in the West was extremely nostalgic and traditionalists and conservative, and definitely felt itself also rightfully, actually, because this was the truth, the depository of the classical legacy that even looking at the Byzantine East was criticism, wasn't quite the same thing in their eyes, because substantially they, and I think they're right, but there is, I'm sorry, I'm throwing ideas in without a proper order, but there is so much to say, in fact, about this. There is a huge debate. Maybe we need a video specifically on this, whether to understand what is in fact the classical legacy. What is that, in fact, at this very time, late antiquity, changed, and what is that to remain the same? Who acquired the legacy of what? Because you know that I am, for example, a Byzantine history lover, but definitely I have certain especially in the recent years, I've kind of strongly reevaluated the Western perspectives during medieval times, because I realized that most of the attitude that sometimes we even have when we rediscover Byzantine history after having fundamentally denied it and grossly stereotyped it, etc., is the exact opposite. I mean, it's not, getting more objective, but kind of, re-magnifying it, and saying, oh, okay, no, it was the best thing ever, we've been told the lie, and myth bust thing is good as long as you, first of all, you spot a real myth, and secondly, if you're actually able to not to fall into another myth. That is, I'm afraid, especially in popular culture among people who rediscover history, etc., is happening once again. Because let's be honest about this, I think historical awareness is on average on the rise, but it's starting also in here from very sometimes very disturbing basis. That is, not looking at history for what it's been without further ideological interests or agendas, but simply saying, okay, I have to pick the winning team, the one that looks best, the one who seemingly was the right one, is cool to back, to support. History can't be observed like this, and we should try as much as possible, although it is really not possible at the end of the day, but we should not pick sides, I believe. We should just concern ourselves to understand the story in the first place, because otherwise it's just naive, it's silly, it's so these are all big questions. We will have definitely to make a video on what the classical legacy is, what even the imperial legacy is. That it's a topic we have touched, especially when talking about the Renovatio Imperii and the imperialistic ambitions in the West that survived the Roman Empire, etc. In the West, in fact, because the Eastern, this showed the survival of the Roman Empire, and definitely also drawing in here a sharp, a line in the first place to say, okay, no, the Byzantine Empire was not a Roman Empire. That's also a gross misunderstanding, really gross, because there is no base for claiming that, and that's still based on the team picking sense, and that's also, and what the worst is about this is that these new prejudices do not actually stem from some original synthesis that are corresponding to new interpretations, but they are actually falling back on historiographical interpretations that are relatively new, modern in time, at least from a couple of centuries at least, and that show us that there is no originality in our criticism arrived at this point, meaning we don't have actually a very well working criticism, because looking at was the most progressed thing, for instance, it's a typical positivistic myth of the 19th century. We are in the 21st century, so why is that we stopped there? What's the point? After centuries of historiography that actually have profitably, conspicuously deconstructed and that interpretation and showed us that things are in a very different way. But it's incredible, really, and this doesn't stop. It's not that it takes to you to go to university to get rid of this. I know plenty of people who got their degree, etc., who kept believing this, because this also is naturally a problem of our educational systems, but in general it's a tendency that people have to follow kind of simplest explanation that maybe they don't even care because it's demonstrated. because they wouldn't even maybe know where to start from in order to demonstrate it, but just because it's a narrative that kind of works, that it's kind of complex enough to show off with it when, I don't know, you go out with someone, you want to talk about something interesting, but at the end of the day, you don't actually know how it really was. And we can definitely say that there was a conscience, even during the same medieval times, that there had been some kind of that there was a different past. Let's say, not, as I said before, a better past, but the idea that it was also accompanied by this idea of relative decline, because even medievals, generally speaking, understood historiographically that something had happened, that they were not naive, and they perfectly had assimilated that, but at the same time they had a very original interpretation capability that we lack completely, which doesn't mean to cover up history or transform it as you like, but actually being able to go beyond and observing other elements. But definitely, as you know, the main prejudices that became to define the what we call today late antiquity, the late Roman Empire. There are various terms actually. Started during the Renaissance. So during the Renaissance, there was obviously this idea that whatever had happened after not just after the Roman Empire, that was conceived in this sense also as a Western and a Western European perspective. That is, of course, during the Renaissance, Constantinople falls. So at a certain point, the Roman Empire finishes really at that time. But the Renaissance looked at mostly the end of the West, of the Roman Empire, let's say better, in the West. So looking at its own Western European perspective. Also because there wasn't much of a Eastern European perspective in this sense, aside from Russia, etc., where countries were peripheral. Most of the Orthodox world at this time was encompassed into the Ottoman by the Ottoman Empire, and therefore, also it's not surprisingly at this time that the stricter Western European idea, the idea of modern Europe begins, because effectively there was, a Western Europe, more or less Western Central, however, stemming from this kind of a also Catholic background that also was broken exactly in those years with by the Reformation, but another side that was fundamentally the Turk. So the Great, the Sublime Gate, the Ottoman Empire, and all this stuff. So the Byzantine perspective in many ways was lost. But nevertheless, it's from the Renaissance that also this late Roman Empire is also starting to be demonized, because even during the Renaissance, nobody thought, like some dumb people believe today, that the Roman Empire was so florid and prosper. One day the terrible barbarians arrived and destroyed everything. Even during the Renaissance, they had a somewhat sophisticated historiographical understanding, and they started observing the crisis of the empire towards this later phase. So from the Renaissance onwards, you have these various definitions like the late empire, the low empire, late antique empire, late antiquity, that came to define over the centuries a period of change, I would say pro excellence. So this was the great narrative, the great framing of this period in historiographically speaking in the West, a moment of change. Because once it was assessed that there had been a big empire that was solid, it was florid, it was powerful, etc., and then this eventually declines for some reason, or apparently declines, or has, however, definitely some transformations. Well, this was the big change. It was not just one change. It was the big change of the world, because objectively that's how the empire was still considered at that time, as a universal empire, not an empire just like all the others. Today, obviously, we expand also our perspectives from geographically, for which we frame the empire also in its surrounding context, etc. We look at the other people's perspectives, but the big thing during the Renaissance was indeed Rome, ancient Greece, and therefore this fully classicist perspective that was looking at the Roman Empire as a model, as a political model that had to be followed in everything. Just think about even the military. Obviously the Renaissance warfare was by self-evidently massively different from the Roman one. But nevertheless, at this time, all these humanist treatises talk about, how to apply Vegetius or other ancient authors in order to emulate the Romans in this, and obviously, having a relatively miserable fail, because eventually armies functioned well on the way they did already. They didn't need something from 1.5 millennia before to know how to operate. But there was this general obsession existing in the Renaissance culture, for which everything was Roman, etc., or classical in general, had to be recovered. Fortunately enough, not all the Renaissance was like this. The Renaissance actually was the thing it was, not much because of the classical legacy, but mostly because of the medieval legacy. Renaissance culture is already way more advanced than the classical one in many ways, and even more subtle, more critical, more aware also of itself. These were all features that had been acquired by the medievals. Through the medieval centuries, the medieval millennium. So this is also pretty overlooked, and it's not a very fashionable opinion, but it is really what the Renaissance was. So the moment of transition, the moment of change. So how to explain this change? How to, its causes, its consequences, its dynamics, etc. So the first approach in general that is still widespread is the and I'm not saying it's necessarily right or wrong. I would say I also lean towards it in some ways, is that it was a negative change. The idea that overall things got worse, which is kind of true. It's hard to deny in certain ways. You don't have to be an necessarily a progressist, a positivist, or a modernist to say, okay, well, there was this time in history when things started to go worse, and we see it economically, environmentally, in terms of life quality. We can assess that. If we have an evidence, if we have a proof of that, we state it. It's not a big deal. The problem is when you go against this, like saying that, I don't know, the Middle Ages were kind of going backwards, or there were a moment of stagnation. Well, that's a mistake. But saying that, classical times had this moment of crisis where things got worse, and for the first and second century of medieval times, during the early Middle Ages, things were kind of worse than had been before. Well, yeah, we can't state that. It's not a big deal. Always stressing naturally that it's contextual, because many people say this. That the worst of it is the explaining the cause. The cause is that people had gone, I don't know, more barbaric or dumber, or more stupid or more indoctrinated, something like that. These are truly stupid interpretations of people who evidently don't understand even the basis of that historical period that you can read from any manual of medieval history. With our historiographical knowledge, that is not a few today. But in general, yes, we can assess that there was something worse that had happened. That's a general statement. Just to think about the economical, the dynamic contraction, the collapse of even in the infrastructural collapse of our world. These are all things we're kind of well aware, and also denying this is, it's foolishness in my opinion, because there is no way. I mean, one thing is loving the Middle Ages. If you truly love an historical period, you have to be honest about it. Well, this is the problem today, that many people just pick a period and have to magnify it, as if I'm a medieval history lover. I'm a medievalist. There is a sheet of paper that tells that I am a medievalist. It's not that I care much about it, but I'm the first person who should be not interested into this. But I personally hate those people who go around saying, okay, well, the Middle Ages was the best thing ever existed. Everything was fine. It was good. It was a pure moment. Everybody was brave and courageous, and all the values. No, that's a comic book interpretation. That's not history. But so that's the main risk you can have in many occasions, and unfortunately today it's easy to have it because I don't know whether fortunately or unfortunately, because one side it proves that more people get access to certain type of information. The problem is that the level of this information or their understanding, because of the time, the chances they have for learning is very limited, and therefore it gives birth to misunderstandings, etc., that are repeated and they echo, and they have a lot of grip, unfortunately, a lot of influence on mass culture, pop culture, and stuff like that. So, but the first picture that was drawn about late antiquity, let's call it in this way, which is kind of the today I know, as a matter of fact, that this is even late antiquity has gone out of fashion in the most radical, chic academic milieu, etc. But because it's too, they found, well, okay, changing definitions is not so bad. It's still an approximation, so it's not going to be a great loss. But I will use late antiquity as a term to define more or less what we're talking about. I'm not a nominalistic Nazi. I believe that if you want to use words like medieval or Byzantine or so, it's not a big deal as long as you understand that, okay, they don't actually mean what it's being attached to it for centuries. You can use them, if anything, to understand what it means. What should I say in order to say Byzantine? Should I say medieval, Roman? It's too, for the sake of grammar. Okay, Byzantine, let's use it. We understand what it is. As long as you know that it was still Roman, we're talking about medieval times, that you know what it is, it's fine. And in fact, in Byzantinistics, it's still used as a term, and it's not a big deal. There are those people who come up and say, you can't use such words, like you can't use the word feudal, because you use the word feudal, so you're not you have to upgrade your bibliography. Well, my bibliography is very well updated, and I can tell you that even in there, the term feudal is still pretty much used. So it's those things, like, when usually people stop to these problems, it's because they don't go much beyond, and that's something you start doing mostly when you begin your university studies. So after the first 2 or 3 years, you should have got rid of these problems if you have made any progress of sort. But aside from this comment, the first picture of this late antique period was of an archetype of every decay, something catastrophic. So the idea that there had been this cool, solid, happy, florid, ancient world, and everything crumbled, and it was so terrible. And it actually didn't even crumble; it decayed. Because the idea of decadence in I made a video on the idea of decadence in Historiographically, is that it's more subtle. It kind of it's less masculine. It's the idea that something doesn't crumble because it was strong, but it was smashed by something harder, and it kind of fell because it was still strong, but it went. No, it's the decay. and it's a moral decay because it's something that happens progressively, that you had the chance to reverse, but you were kind of too lazy or too effeminate or too something like that, that it kind of rotted itself away in some measure. So the concept of decadence has dominated really, and still dominates our mentality about this, because it's not just about decadence, but it's about moral disgust. This idea that we talked recently about the pre-Raphaelites, that I explained you in that video. I don't really love them at all. Some paintings especially are I like them, but they're still, sometimes they show this kind of they were obsessed a little bit with the decadence as well of the ancient world. They like to picture this kind of strangely sensual, erotic and ambiguous world where it was so sophisticated and refined, but it was kind of rotten inside. That went in hand to hand a little bit with Romanticism. So the idea that at the end of the day, those who won over the empire were the barbarians, that maybe they were rougher, but they still had true feelings, they were truer to their ideas. Interestingly enough, these were to their ideals. Sorry. Interestingly enough, this is a interpretation that was circling into the Roman conservative milieu back in the day. When you find Tacitus, or better Tacitus, writing about the Germans, that were the good savages. They were kind of primitives, violent, etc. But they were the true strong warriors that the Romans at that point, even still in the 2nd century, they had ceased to be, and now they were falling. Interestingly enough, Tacitus at a certain point writes, if you see at the face of an empire, I don't remember, I'm paraphrasing, you can see that he was basically foretelling the end of the empire itself. So this idea of the end of the empire, of the decay, is partly also a Roman legacy, a Roman interpretation, because especially the senatorial classes that wanted to that were losing power fundamentally at that time, especially during the early empire, because the emperor was emerging as a ever greater political authority, was the passage from republic to empire, aside from the fact that it doesn't actually mean anything from an institutional point of view, because the empire already existed before, and the empire kept being a republic informally, but it was perceived at the time as the decadence of the ancient Roman mores, their Roman ethics and values, etc., and so on. So they were self-sponsoring their own perception in here. And what is interesting and notoriously about Roman history is that from Roman times we don't actually know that much, first of all. Secondly, most of what we know comes definitely from the aristocratic perspective. So even this is an interesting point to make, because I don't know, there are people who maybe believe that we know less from the Middle Ages than from Roman times. Absolutely false. From the Middle Ages we have literally an explosion of sources. Of course, not from the very first Middle Ages, but actually pretty soon, and in a pretty consistent way. Also, simply, by the way, because they were also closer times, so there were different relations with writing, with preserving material, etc. So preserving written documents, etc. Also material, actually. But so we are luckier, and we kind of have more, because it's a kind of a more modern time. But still, when we look at the ancient world, we always have to be aware that it was narrated to us chiefly through the elites, through the elite perspective. And that influences a lot, because indeed, even if you look at what happened, in fact, in the West, in the senatorial classes, chiefly of Italy, or this kind of, however, heavily Romanized Western European lands, you realize that, in that area of the empire, there had been a kind of a greater crisis, definitely, that brought to the western half to vanish. While the Byzantine East, with all its kind of more evident, more kind of Hellenic influenced character than Latin influenced character, kind of survived better. It survived in the first place, but it also, also with very solid bases. This is often misunderstood. It's full of people out there who would like to kill Constantine because they think that the empire started to crumble only when he started. Well, that's one of the examples of how not to approach history. I mean, if you have to approach history to come up with these conclusions, do not approach history, or at least approach it from some other ways, or keep your mouth shut at least. But it's an example of how we need to find, still the guilty one, the one who made the empire fall, because there has to be someone who is guilty of it. It was someone, especially in some parts of the Western world. There is this obsession with the idea of tyranny, for which the great historical changes have not been caused by massive structural problems that are very difficult to understand, etc. But it's because there was one evil guy who did bad, and therefore everybody is kind of paying for that. It's a very simplistic view of history at best. And especially in this case, doesn't mean anything. On the contrary, actually, figures like Diocletian, especially like Constantine, gave to the empire a new stamina, a greater strength, a greater solidity that was actually the thing that made the empire surviving for another millennium. How many empires do you know that lasted for millennia? Honestly. Also in here we can't open many parentheses, but it's still very meaningful. I mean, you can't look at the empire in itself and consider it as a failure in some sense, because the institutional assets that Augustus gave lasted for 3 centuries. And find me another sovereign in history that was able to do what Augustus did from a political point of view, to build what it did. Now think about Constantine, or at least whoever built, in fact, the Eastern Roman Empire. Because Constantine was at the head of the state, etc. But it's not that we know much in the details in terms of reforms and administration. Obviously, there were other people who worked with him, etc. Also, several measures that Constantine used to shift and to rebuild in a way the center of power in the East had been used before with some of his predecessors, even some of his enemies. Here we're not judging the person whether you like Constantine or not, but whether to understand how it practically worked. And whatever happened, it did work. Another huge prejudice is the one about the late Roman army. That people still genuinely believe that, at least for the 4th century, was something inferior than the previous Augustan army. I will spend tens and tens of videos in detail to explain why this is not the case, because it's not, and it just takes to know 4th century military history to kind of understand it. So if you really want to make it simple, which is not, but the lines at the end are relatively simple. So the idea of decay, the idea that something got wrong. This is also another interpretation. I mean, there were wrong choices. An advice that I give you, very, open-heartedly is never think that if you had been there you would have done better, because chances are that you probably would have made crumble everything, being projected 2,000 years in times back, and pretending to know what those people were living in. Of course, we don't have to indulge even into the idea that every political choice was kind of good, logical, but the more you study history in general, even in our days, you realize that there is always kind of an iron logic in in most, especially let's say most of the greatest political choices that are taken. Because most of the times, actually, political choices are not even the driving factor of the thing. I mean, it definitely takes... I mean, without a person like Constantine, you see that the world would have been completely different. We would have probably not had even a Roman Empire lasting for another millennium, actually. But it's still true that some of the greatest politicians in history have actually been great, not much because they have invented something new, but because they have understood what was the current strongly heading to, and instead of then going against it, that would have been a lost fight, they kind of followed it, they favored it, and they exploited the same current to establish more solid basis to restart the situation from. I know that many people don't like such interpretations because they automatically think that choices like the one of Constantine were bad, were inherently bad, and they think that it's self-evident that having shifted the capital wasn't even shifted. Even during Constantine, actually the capital of the empire was Rome, but remained Rome. But this idea of having rebuilt Byzantium and making it Constantinople and having shifted the center of power in the east, etc. Aside from the fact that it already existed in part, now Rome was definitely not the most strategically important land, in cities like Trier, like Milan, like Sirmium, like Nicomedia, etc. were way more important already, even before Constantine. But mostly for military needs, because that's what the empire at that point was concerned itself mostly with, in more than in the past at least. But I don't remember what I was heading to with this, but the idea that the choice was inherently bad is that they stopped to the idea that, okay, things more or less started to go wrong from there on. Well, actually they didn't. The things started to go seriously wrong during the 3rd century. And they started to go seriously wrong mostly from internal matters of the empire. That definitely many people start saying, well, in the 3rd century, it's a moment when the emperors kind of became less Roman, more effeminated, more even kind of looking at Eastern cults and not the true ancient Roman ones. So they kind of keep stressing the idea. But if you actually look at what was happening there, and you look at the responses that the empire enacted in a pretty messed up situation, by the way, you realize that they didn't go that bad. And if you look at figures like Aurelianus or the same Constantine, etc., these are figures that respectively saved and reshaped the empire in ways that at the end of the day functioned. The fact that the West eventually vanished didn't even crumble. It simply vanished. It simply melted away during the end of the 5th century is also something you can't attribute to those choices. It kind of went along its own way. There were a number of choices that could have reversed a certain trend. There was no teleological reason for which the Western Roman Empire had necessarily to fall into the 5th century. Absolutely not. Actually also has the very last events of the Western Roman Empire that are normally, in fact, narrated as a irreversible decadence show otherwise, because it would have taken even up to Majorianus fundamentally. It was possible to reunite at least the Western Mediterranean, and it was just because of single figures like Gaiseric, king of the Vandals, but also other fortuitous events that eventually didn't happen. With the failure of Majorianus' campaign, it was understood that at that point Italy alone had exhausted its own resources, at least for some generation, and that's a moment where okay, yeah, the empire actually didn't even, in fact, crumble in itself. It was simply disbanded, like saying, okay, we don't need it anymore. In 476 AD, giving back the imperial insignia to Constantinople was just a political move that now served Odoacer to receive a certain legitimization from Constantinople. To the balance is more complex than what is often said. But it practically didn't happen anything, aside from the fact that Italy was first reinvaded by the Ostrogoths that were entering in the peninsula on behalf of the empire, and after that the same Byzantines reconquered Italy before losing it, in part at least, to the Longobards, and then remaining there for centuries and centuries. This idea that the West kind of fell because it was like that, it's inconsistent actually. And as a matter of fact, the real destruction, the real crumbling, was mostly at least for Italy, the Gothic War. The Gothic War was not even because of the Gothic invasion, because actually the Goths had been ruling for more than 40 years, actually, with great success, with great peace, and functional Roman administration into Italy. Italy was still Roman in this sense. In culture, it was pretty late antique. Of course, late antiquity means something different and had already changed. But and this is also important methodologically to say, okay, well, late antiquity is something that kind of we arrived to. It's not something that broke out when we think late antique times were, at least usually. But so this for saying that even Roman culture, Roman civilization ended kind of very late, and not even after the fall of the, not even before or in the moment of the disbandment of the western half of the empire. This is particularly important because normally we start talking about late antiquity from the 4th century. Okay. I also here some like to stress the 3rd century as the major moment of transformation, which really was. The 3rd century was a great moment of transformation indeed. And it was probably at a structural level the moment in which late antiquity was formed in the way we stereotype it. But just for saying that transformation is already a better world rather than decay, or than decline. There are other things I wanted to say which I don't remember. Well, whatever, we surely come across it. We will surely speak about this. But talking about the 20th century, how this evolution actually continued. Well, from the 20th century, there were other ideas that started discovering the traces, the hints of actually a sort of necessary and positive evolution, which is also difficult to accept. Definitely there were some, I can't say nor necessary nor positive changes, but something that, however, had to that there was a sort of positive response to certain problems that were being presented. You can interpret late antiquity in the sense that late antique culture was not at all a moment of stagnation of ideas, of capabilities. Even the people who are obsessed by technology should know that the certain revival in technology actually started occurring exactly from the late antique times, because up to the moment when the Roman Empire was fundamentally at its apex and there weren't substantial enemies threatening its frontiers, the same empire had not cared much about evolving in investing in certain technologies research. during late Empire there was some sort of that, not just in the East, where obviously on average there was a greater Hellenistic legacy, so also greater interest toward at least theoretical science. But you realize that even in the army that there were certain kind of innovations that kicked in, and they were kind of effective, and they were in fact feared by the enemies of Rome, and that also not because of technology, but the reorganization of their armed forces and certain refinements, etc., brought the Romans for centuries to remain evidently the most powerful military in the world. The fact, not really in the world, because China is a valid competitor as well, but in the Roman world, in the Mediterranean, European world, the Romans were able to cope with all kind of enemies, and the fact that eventually large parts of the empire were lost to other peoples doesn't actually prove that there had been a qualitative decline. It was actually a structural collapse that was in part seemingly also environmental, so that there wasn't much you could do about it, and you realize also the difficulties of maintaining an empire. Many misunderstandings towards the late Roman Empire actually derived from a sort of 19th century national state idealization of the empire. Many people who stress the fact that the Roman Empire was kind of declined at this time because it was so cool before, is that because they generally think that it was a kind of a perfectly centralized state where everything was kind of uniform and everything worked fine, and there weren't substantial differences in their components, that there were actual physical borders or stuff like that. Well, this is in fact the perspective that was built up historiographically in the 19th century, where that was the idea of state. But the Roman Empire wasn't at all like that. The Roman Empire, and this is very important to understand, was effectively an empire. It has nothing to do with Victorian empires. It has to do with the idea of having a military deterrent that is actually pretty reduced, because if you look at the Roman army, it was kind of pretty large, but at the same time, considering the average population, especially during the Principate, wasn't actually big armed force. That was meant to submit peoples rather than lands, that it still encompassed theoretically the world-known world. Because Rome didn't actually have a true boundary in itself. The idea that there were kind of outsiders and insiders is pretty misleading to understand the reality of the empire. Other peoples that lived along what we call the limes, that seemingly wasn't even called like this by the Romans themselves, were de facto feeling or being considered, or in a way or another, part of the empire themselves, because they were under Rome, which is something very, very different from a 19th century national state. It wasn't also a lay world. This is also another enormously widespread prejudice. The idea that Rome was a sort of lay state. Rome lay? With a lay culture? Are we kidding? Or what? Rome was not at all. Everything, literally everything starting from the empire in itself was based on religion, and I would say solely on religion. The same idea of tolerance we have the Roman Empire is very different from the modern idea of tolerance. Before the 17th century, whether we're talking about the ancient world, the medieval world, there was nothing like the tolerance we intend today. There was just a sort of balance of forces. The Roman Empire also persecuted some cults, not just Christianity at the beginning, but also others. It was definitely open. It was definitely inclusive in many ways, but it wasn't lay. It wasn't based on principles of equality or stuff like that, but at all. The same went with Christianity. With Christianity, it was definitely an inclusiveness that was open only to Christians in this sense, partly to a very few. The Jews always had this kind of particular role into the Christian world since this time. But let's say that there is nothing like tolerance as we intended today. Another big change was in fact the Christianization of the empire, and also in here, conversely, actually, the idea that that Christianity weakened the empire is another pile of bollocks. Honestly, not only there is no historical evidence of this. If anything, Christianity, in the moment it was accepted as a licit religion, eventually also a religion of state, gave further strength to the empire, especially to the administration, because the church managed other, certain, it kind of absorbed the consequence, the effects of the main social transformations of the time. It was in charge of local administration. It had a structure on its own. It controlled the territory. It also the passage from paganism to Christianity was also extremely slow. Even when pagan cults were actually forbidden, there were of course persecutions. There was definitely violence, but by modern mentality, these are from one side and on the other brutally emphasized. Objectively, nor pagan nor Christian persecutions were the witch hunt, the mass witch hunt and slaughter and extermination that we imagine. Local governors actually acted in very different ways depending on the situation. It was usually a political move. They didn't actually give a damn about religion, also because most of the people remained fundamentally either pagan or kind of a hybrid between paganism and Christianity, which is something that actually lasted until, you can't say even the last century, because if you just look at what the beliefs of the modern peasantry, contemporary peasantry actually was, it was mostly a matter of elite, and it was a political game. And this is valid for actually most of religious issues that, like, you can imagine. Not that religion was not important in the equation, but it was a vehicle for other, dialectical, to other interests, as always. Even all these, Arianism, Catholicism, were things that, nobody, I believe, was really much concerned about in strictly theological terms. In terms of actual belief. I mean, I'm talking about the protagonists of this, like, the Byzantine emperors that kind of converted to Arianism sometimes. It was all political. All political. It still happens today. Probably, actually, most of the the average inhabitant of the empire was probably more concerned that of religion, of morality, than we can imagine. Actually, both the pagan and the Christian worlds were extremely stern worlds, and this not because they were pagan or Christian, but because the society of that time was very stern, was very conservative, was very because society literally functioned in that way, and there weren't other options to make it work in a different way. We're talking about strong, inflexible socio-economical systems that have that potential, can work only in that fashion. The same goes for the role of men, of women. It's not something dictated by taste, by idea. It was dictated by the actual functions that these individuals had in that society. So interpreting those years, like for our bizarre individual projections of 2019, is definitely dumb, inadequate, frankly dangerous. We will have time to go in depth into this, but fundamentally, as you can understand, also the idea that, I don't know, the Christian army was kind of less efficient than a pagan army. Can you prove me this? I'm a military historian. I've studied a little bit of these things. Can you actually prove me that the Roman military was less effective because of Christianity? Are we kidding? Have you actually studied what the, ethical values of, I don't know, 7th century Byzantine soldiers were? Do you know how these people actually thought the whole thing? How reality was? How do you think Christianity created problems in this sense? And don't come tell me, okay, there were those who were reticent to the levy, because those were, aside from the fact that there is a whole Christian geography that had to overemphasize the fact that there were these opposants to the army, etc. But the same Christian society was the one that transformed these saints that were allegedly refusing to shed blood as soldiers because they were converted to Christianity. Christianity was the same civilization that made these become warrior saints that were adored because they slaughtered enemies in the tradition and in the legend. So let's get rid of this garbage when we're talking about actual history, because one thing is history in fact, another thing is wasting time, and that's what it is. Other things we can say, well, it would be plenty of examples to make. I promise we'll deal with them in detail in other videos. Now we have to go on, and so also this necessary and positive evolution of society is very debatable at best. Let's say that even the same concept of necessity and positivity is wrong as a historical approach or instrument of analysis. But at least in the 20th century, there was this first acknowledgement that not all the late antiquity had been a bad moment, a moment of decline. There was at least the awareness now that things were kind of more doubly fast and phased, and they had to be understood more thoroughly. The conclusion in general was that between the 3rd and the 5th century especially was a sort of an end of classicity, that we have already challenged as an idea. Today is not believed anymore. Today we know pretty we know the temporal geography of this. I mean, where actually late antiquity survived more or less, and when. Where were there moments of not of brute of drastic change, the moments of break, of caesura, if you want. But we kind of have an idea that definitely late antiquity didn't stop by the 5th century. Even events that were grotesquely depicted, like, I don't know, the sack of Rome by the hands of the Visigoths in 410. That's where the empire fell. No, it didn't, first of all. Secondly, Rome remained a large, big, wealthy city even after the sack. It recovered very quickly, and that's also proof that this world wasn't that decaying. Rome was effectively destroyed during the Gothic War, and it still remained the largest city in the West. Afterwards, the greatest cultural and political center of the West in terms of being a urban center. So it's very, very debatable. The real obsession, I would say, is the search for the roots of modernity into the classical world. This was, I think, of these first approaches, the greatest mistake. So there had to be a sort of justification. You had to find a reason why, we had achieved modernity back in the Roman Empire. No, we didn't. We didn't. That wasn't a modern world. We have definitely a lot of elements of our modernity, of our culture in general, that stem from that world. But aside from the fact that they stemmed also from much before sometimes, but in general, it wasn't a modern world. You can definitely spot parts of these roots, but you can't load the Roman Empire, you can project in the Roman Empire your modernity. Because it's actually, if you really care about the Roman Empire, that's humiliating. And probably the ancient Romans would be literally shocked by the way we depict them, as historically speaking, because they would tell us that we probably miss completely the point of who they were and what they believed and what was important for them. There were naturally other impulses that brought further attribution of different historical values to late antiquity. Just think about today's, today, what I hate today is, and that's the reason also partly why I'm not a great, unfortunately, I'm not a great connoisseur of late antiquity, albeit I love it. In fact, is that it's become extremely fashionable in academies. If you look at how many books are published in the last years, I don't know about just the figure of Constantine, it's an overload, let's be honest. It's an overload. And why? Because it's fashionable. Just look at how many books have been published, I don't know, on for the 14th century. There is no comparison. And this has to do not with the availability of sources, that for figures like Constantine are renowningly, asphyctic, because we don't know almost anything about these figures. But it's a matter of our culture and how we need to portray those times and produce books on it and to sell and to make money. And therefore we also need to create a mythology of them, which is probably very dangerous. So that's the reason why I don't like this fashion. I mean, I know so many medievalists who are kind of interested in, now that even in my university that study late antiquity. I mean, you're a medievalist. Why do you have to study late antiquity, study ancient history? I mean, I realize that maybe, it's kind of close to the Middle Ages as well, but now it's become normal. Like saying, okay, well, I'm a medievalist, but I studied late antiquity. There is no comparison. Really, no comparison by the infinite amount of sources that exist on the Middle Ages and the ones you have on the late antiquity, to claim that this is not a fashion. Nothing but that, because it's inexplicable otherwise. And you know why is this? In part, it's part of our problems, the problems of today, the problems of migration, the problems of identity, the problems of religion, and all this stuff. So, since our pop culture today has become so hysterical about these ideas and utterly that doesn't understand it, there are people who have to make money to go around to claim, to talk about things that have nothing to do with actually that world for real, but that still talk about these controversial things. Of course, I'm approximating. It's full of great and competent scholars about late antiquity. It is a very important period in history and should be definitely deepened as a topic in research, etc. But I still see so much ideologism behind so many things that happen in academies, and how money flow and all these relations, that you understand that true love for history sometimes is betrayed, or maybe has never existed in some people, and these other kind of fashions go on and they don't even look about other periods that are way better documented, arguably also more important, and that nobody actually cares about. And that's why I started a PhD on a topic that is completely, not completely, but deeply overlooked in many ways, and underestimated. It was arguably way more important than at least in strictly historical terms. I mean, given the quality of information that we can draw from it, from even the late antiquity, just like many other periods, but I don't have anything against late antiquity, I promise you. Actually, I find it very fascinating. I find it very mind-blowing in many ways, if you interpret it correctly, or if you try to do it, at least. It can give you so much back. So I urge you actually to know more about late antiquity, but always being aware that such cultural influences driven by current ideologies have deeply to do with how history is told and presented today, especially to the greater public, that is fundamentally misled, because that's the only way you can make money. Fundamentally, you don't want people to actually understand what you're talking about, but just remain like, that's history, and then letting them know. This is very late antique, by the way, because that's how the politically and culturally things worked at the time. Back in the day, in the classical times, in fact, people usually opened books, they read them, they consumed them. In late antique times, society got crystallized. Books became objects of aesthetical objects. They were, so with all the gems and precious stones on their cover, etc., they were closed dramatically. If you look in history of art, you realize that the late antique book is a closed book, because it was going beyond. It fundamentally tell you that there was a kind of a hidden knowledge, a superior knowledge that you had kind of to struggle to reach, and this was camped by all the great scholars, the few great scholars, of your great thinkers. It has to do also naturally with Christianity, in part, but not all like that, because in this sense, Christianity followed the trend. I mean, early Christianity definitely read the Bible a lot, even writing more to it, but in the late antiquity there was also strengthening over orthodoxy, a greater control of the state on religion and all this stuff. So that was also instrumental to the to the control of the kind of detachment of the masses from certain problems. That happens when usually the masses crumble, not they decline. And that's probably the most important thing to know about late antiquity. The middle classes mostly. I believe that whichever period has a crisis of the middle classes from an economical point of view is not a very happy period in general, and that's also why I think that today's times are pretty dramatic under this sense. And I'll tell you more, that I believe that we without any easy forcing of parallelisms, but we are living in a relatively similar period to late antiquity. There are many elements in common, and this fact of the decline of the middle class, in my opinion, is the key point. But going on, there is a name that is a terrible name. Edward Gibbon. Now, of course, I don't want to demonize Gibbon, because it's become very fashionable for every medieval history or even Byzantine history lover to say, okay, Gibbon is fundamentally what we use today to show what is not a true historian. Edward Gibbon at the time, between the 18th and the 19th century, was actually a very good historian, and even his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is still a good read. I mean, I give you that. It's important. Naturally, he drew a picture that actually since his own times was criticized, and that was kind of embodying the Enlightenment perspective of, in fact, the decline of the empire, of the Enlightened Empire, brought down by this, corrupted morals, partly by Christianity, and all this stuff. And I must say that his work is still what largely influences the major that influences the most the major negative stereotypes existing on late antiquity today. And the this work that he wrote in the second half of the 18th century was naturally has to be contextualized, because there was definitely an evident affinity between his own age and the 2nd century AD, because these were moments of greater splendor, let's say, respectively, of modern and classical civilization. So Gibbon believed that the processes that had brought to the decline and of the one and the other were kind of similar. So definitely influenced by authors, enlightened authors like Montesquieu and Voltaire, he individuated into Christianity because of the end of the empire. So yeah, that's today we don't believe in this anymore. It's a wrong theory, and it's not a matter of personal opinion. This is what I would like to make people understand, that it's not because I believe it or someone else's believe it, or mainstream historiography today believes in the academies. It's that actually, from what we know today, we know, or at least we have no data to say that, no historical evidence to say that Christianity was the cause of the end of the empire. And we can also explain why, because we don't, not only we don't have evidence of it, but we actually have evidence of lots of other things also about Christianity that definitely show us that it's not the case. And we will definitely make a video about this, because it's necessary at a certain point. However, if you look into my medieval Christianity playlist, I've made several videos about not actually this topic, but actually the very about the hybrid of pagan and Christian culture during late antiquity and so on. So I think I smoothed a little bit the most angry prejudices, let's say, that exist on the topic. And remember that at the time they weren't reasoning like you think like you do in the first place. I mean, if you believe in this theory. If you don't, you know what I'm talking about. But it's still important for people who still don't know to tell them, look, this is not a matter of being Christian or being an atheist. This has nothing to do with that, because in history we are historians, and of course we are influenced by whichever our beliefs are. But in today's historiographical methods, we are under proof. We are put under test. I mean, if you write bullshit today in the academy, you are kind of not ostracized, but people are gonna criticize you pretty heavily. So we have pretty sophisticated ways of spotting what is wrong, because we have pretty sophisticated historiographical means that tell us, this is the source, what it's telling. Okay, is this compatible with this idea, with this theory? No, because it's not compatible. If you lack the ring, if you lack the step, the logical step, you can keep it as an hypothesis, but you can't say whether it's true or not. And this is not a rhetorical game to say, okay, let's hide history, let's not be 100% sure. If you're not 100% sure about something, but 99%, you can't prove a theory. It's not like that, because still theory is all kind of history. Sorry, it's all kind of theoretical in this sense. But this is not a matter of opinion, in the sense that if you want to demonstrate something, you have to prove it. And most of the people who believe in these things do not know what historically means to prove something. They don't have evidence. They just project this narrative in their mind where history lays and say, okay, it's gone like that. It's literally how it happens. Because either you don't like... this goes both ways, actually. There are people who have huge prejudices against paganism. There are people who have huge prejudices against Christianity. And when you go look why this happens, it's usually because they're respectively either theists or atheists, and that's the real problem. When you make history, you can't reason like that, because otherwise it's not history. It's just your fantasy, your ideology, your delirium at the end of the day, because you need a reasonable answer, and it's full of extremely objective theist and atheist historians as well. So those stand out like examples of people who have their own individual beliefs, their subjective beliefs, that when it comes to their work, they're very deontologically correct. They're very ethical. And those are the historians we need today. Not a bunch of exalted, nuts who have to stress their political agenda, because that's ultimately what it is. Even when it comes to religion, in my opinion, because it's it can really happen like that. And definitely the 19th century was very important for the structuring of a greater awareness about late antiquity. The 19th century, as you know, was a great moment of rediscovery of the Middle Ages in general, and late antiquity went kind of accordingly, because it was perceived in many ways as not much as the beginning of the Middle Ages, but definitely something that had to be understood also on that ground. Also in here for reasons that maybe were not excessively pure in many ways. The 19th century is the great century of nationalism, the moment in which kind of pseudo strictly scientific racism was born. It was a very controversial century, and there were kind of two different souls that looked either one towards progress, the other towards I can say a greater nostalgia towards certain things, but it was, as I was saying, a controversial century. And on that video made on the Middle Ages, I think the title is Picture and Reality or something like that, I kind of explained better these concepts. The general idea that there had been maybe a rough time back in the day, there had been a decline, so this was partly even accepted, but it was a decline that in a certain sense brought out new forces, brought on the foreground new forces that managed to take over. So from here you can understand also the national perspective. Definitely the German historiography was the leading one in medieval studies. There was a great work thinking about the Monumenta Germania Historica and all these source collections that really sensed every single source of the Middle Ages. That point was known at that point, at least, and that we still use in part. If we look at the primary sources, I mean, these are kind of the versions that were written in the 19th century that are relatively still, very useful for us to study today, because they were written for the original manuscripts, and so it was a great work of research, etc. It actually had been started back in the day, chiefly by the studies of Muratori in Italy, even from the fact that late 17th, beginning of 18th century. But it's the 19th century where this kind of explodes in many ways. So you can understand also at that time Germany wasn't being invested by nationalism. There was this idea now that the Germans kind of took over the empire, and they had this leading role, so they were being in a certain sense magnified. But this is not the point I wanted to make. The point is that overall there was a greater attention dedicated to late antiquity, but not even in the 19th century, in spite of the awareness that was being expanded on it, that there was never it didn't come to an end. The idea of the conviction, let's say, that the transformation was radical and negative, didn't actually die out. There had been some contributions to punctualize the difference between the two epochs, but not quite to take away that negative stigma of radical decline, etc. So, as we were saying now, the study of the last phase of the Roman Empire was intertwined with the development of nationalisms that were exalting the contraposition between ethnicities, and bringing to identify, especially in the barbarian invasions, the principal motive for the death of Rome. This is extremely simplistic. Even in here, the barbarian invasions today are definitely not conceived as the major cause of the fall of the Roman Empire. They weren't surely the determining factor. Actually, by the 5th century, as we were saying before, the Western Roman Empire could as well survive. And what is often forgotten is that also these barbarian populations weren't dwelling that well, were on the verge of annihilation, depending on the political developments, etc. So the barbarian invasions definitely were a determining but not a decisive factor of the fall of Rome, and this is the best historical assessment you can give, broadly speaking. We have, I think, in the migration era playlist, and now it's pretty hefty, I've extensively explained at this point what the German, especially Germanic attitude was towards the Roman Empire. It wasn't at all destructive, at all. They didn't want to destroy Rome. There was never an active destruction of the Roman Empire at the hands of the Germans, at least. The other peoples were different, like the Huns. Actually, not even the Huns wanted to destroy the empire, because they actually profited from its integrity, because it was much easier to be paid from an emperor than from a myriad of tribes that they had all to subdue individually, to take a tribute from. It was more unitary. Definitely there were other, there were the Sassanids, who came actually pretty close, especially during the 6th century, to conquer, to put an end to the empire, because they were spreading far and wide. Now the empire had consistently shrunk to only the eastern provinces, so it was a kind of a problem at that point. But there was never, especially from the Germanic populations, the need to destroy the empire. Never. Even when the actual damage was caused, it was mostly for contingental reasons, like drawing resources for going on within the empire, by the way, interestingly enough. And definitely these Germanic populations always sought the Roman recognition for their own government, because that was definitely a very great asset on for their deconstruction of local powers. And the relation is very complicated, but once again, as I said, in the migration era playlist, if you follow, especially those videos I made on the single barbarian peoples, that the individual barbarian peoples that at the end of the day entered in contact with the empire, was you observed that their relation with the empire was extremely it was actually ambiguous. I mean, and it's not that the Germans felt happy to be, they never felt Romans, for example. That is pretty evident. Nor they cared to be ruled by Rome. So evidently they fought, evidently they added to the problems that the empire had. But they always remained first of all, very fearful of the empire, because they knew that theoretically, if the empire wanted, it could wipe them out. And this actually happened for a couple of them, and several others risked it consistently. But in general, they didn't rationalize the need for destroying Rome. You actually don't find any single Germanic population that said, okay, we have to annihilate the empire because of the sake of it. You don't find any one of them. They didn't care. In a certain sense, they couldn't even formulate this concept, because their interests were way more limited. An empire like the Sassanid one could do it. The Sassanids wanted to destroy the Roman Empire. They ended up being destroyed, actually, but they, in turn, by the Romans, and eventually by the Muslims, that exploited the situation by taking them over, taking over them, and also seizing great parts of the Roman Empire, because they had exhausted each other because of their wars. They were lethal, they were deadly, But in the West, this was very, very different, and as we were saying before, also the same disbandment of the western half of the empire was in many ways also meaningless in actual institutional. Let's say, was not very significant in. Okay, it was significant, it was meaningful, of course, but because of those circumstances, not because it took away something from the empire, effectively. Another important, vital thing that you have to know at every time when judging late antiquity is that there has never, and I mean never ever, been something like two Roman empires. When we talk about the splitting of West and East, the Pars Occidentis and the Pars Orientis, we're not talking about two empires. The empire is one. It remains always one. These divisions were merely administrative. It is true that these two parts arrived to, pursue relatively different political goals. Never quite much. They haven't even. Sometimes their attritions escalated, to open warfare, but it was relatively few. I'm not talking about those wars that were done like by usurpers, etc., because that's not actually a clash between the two halves. But definitely there were different interests, there were different commands in this sense, because the administrative repartition equated to this, but were never like things like two empires. In fact, when Odoacer gave back the imperial eagles to the west, to the eastern of the west, to Constantinople, he didn't put an end to the empire. He didn't put an end to anything. He simply gave back the eagles to whoever they belonged to, because now what happened is that they decided to elect no emperor anymore. So that's not putting an end to the empire, to destroy it, to conquer it, but it didn't happen like that. That sounded pretty much like, now please me Constantinople, give me a formal sanction of my rule here in Italy. That's how it fundamentally went. Odoacer wasn't at the head of a people. He was at the head of the Germanic auxiliaries that made up the Western Roman army at the time. So that's how it was. So, and aside from this, there is also this misconception that you find all around. I was going, I don't remember where, just the other day, looking at on YouTube, that was someone saying like, oh, of course, definitely, the empire fell. It was weakened, at least by the fact that the empire was split. And I fundamentally don't even understand the logic behind this. Like, why is that it should have grown weaker? How do people, they because that's their tactic. How they dialectically operate. It's not that they even try to explain or think what the situation was at the time. Just say, okay, well, the empire was bigger before, so if you split it, it becomes weaker. What does it mean? If anything, actually was a very intelligent thing to do, that was already understood since the 4th century. Obviously, the successory mechanisms at the time with Diocletian's tetrarchy didn't work quite well, but the overall idea of splitting an empire is that you can administrate it better if you have a greater decentralization. This is actually how the empire benefited administratively from from the split of even increasing the local government. The Roman Empire had been governed up to late antiquity mostly through a sort of decentralized fashion that for which the local governors did fundamentally whatever they liked. So also in here the idea of a centralized empire was the empire became way more centralized during the late Roman times than the apex of during the Principate. That's another thing that should make us reflect. And definitely bureaucracy is not always the best option, but at this time it kind of was still, because it was a way, in fact, to sectorize resources, to control them better, to of course spend a freaking lot of money also for bureaucracy in itself, but still having a higher control on what before was just saying, okay, let's leave these populations that we have conquered being ruled without any particular pressure, and let's simply go with it. Now, no, the emperors rightfully wanted to control better every single resource, to save it from usurpers, to shift them away from the frontiers that were now threatened by the invasions. And generally speaking, splitting the empire was saying, okay, let's have a more rational, let's have a rationalization of resources, and let's concentrate a single government on one half and one on the other, so that we know better what we're doing. So, and what is interesting about this that vanishes every kind of, the idea that the empire was weaker for this, is that fundamentally the two empires always supported each other. I mean, even if you look at the last days of the empire, you may think, when I'm talking about the Byzantine naval expedition against the Vandal kingdom, that eventually was allegedly enormous, but at that time the Eastern Roman Empire was fundamentally acting on behalf of the Western Roman Empire to go save it from the Vandals that were choking Italy by controlling the grain from Africa fundamentally, and they would have maintained, if they had retaken Africa, it would have given them back to the West. I mean, that was a massive military operation that was aimed at supporting the West against the threats posed by the Vandalic kingdom, at least in structural terms, and to eventually give back that land to the empire, to the West. So, aside from this clicks, but they're kind of fed up with these stupid pictures. I don't know what I was saying now. Whatever. We will do without that picture. I'm selecting the pictures and putting in the background, so I was just messing up with certain things. And so there was never a kind of conflict that brought ultimately to the idea that the West wasn't was criminal. It is true that there were things like, I don't know, for instance, when the Huns or other populations went in the East was, in order to survive, was actually pretty fast to redirect these migratory fluxes or invasions mostly towards the West. But as we've seen, till the very last years of the empire was actually no final collapse of the West. The West still had its own military, its own projecting capabilities. I mean, Majorianus in the 6th of the 5th century, so just a couple of, not even 2 decades before the empire formally fell, it disbanded. From Italy, had reconquered Spain. I'm telling only this. Had reobtained the submission of the Visigoths, that at this time were kind of like with patches on them. There were a few, they had an endemic situation. The only ones who didn't surrender were the Vandals, and effectively these brought, if you want in perspective, were probably the determining factor of the fall of the West, at least in the way it happened in those last years, because basically they cut off the last resources that, if Majorianus or the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman fleet sent to Africa had succeeded against them. Majorianus was defeated at I don't remember whether at Cartagena or I don't know, where he was defeated by the Vandals in Spain, that now were feeling threatened because they knew that they would have been the next one in the line to be annihilated after the Visigoths, or at least to be subjected. Well, yeah, you have much even to a chief like a Geiseric that, in fact, changed history in this sense at that point. But that's just an example of how it may as well not fall. The idea of splitting the empire in the way it happened historically at the end of the 4th century, chiefly, that was the definitive one, because the empire eventually was not reincorporated, or at least until the 476, that there were these two halves, but was dictated by evident sectorizations of resources. Like, you govern better, something that, and this is actually one of the reasons that brought to the development of modernity. Today, in historiography, we consider the success of Western Europe during the Renaissance, even in its capability of clashing against the Turks, because of its own fragmentation. Because it's been observed that great empires that kind of rule over many resources tend, and this is just a physical evidence, to dispel more resources into the process. That is, to burn more, without, accidentally, than smaller empires. That's why, for instance, Europe, in spite of being chronically, politically fragmented, historically speaking, it rose to literally conquering the world by the 19th century. And it something that the Chinese Empire was consistently, until the 18th century, more powerful than any European power, basically stagnated and was devoured. It was eaten alive by the Europeans. Still remaining, because Europeans were mostly interested about Chinese coast, etc. But this has been explained because it was observed how, especially with the development of bankery system, etc., that didn't quite exist in late antiquity as in that fashion, because there was the ancient world was much less had much less potential in this sense, allowed to sectorize the resources and shift in them when something was going wrong in one of these single states towards other states or towards other banks that were saving money in this fashion. So this is now today seen as a proof of modernity. Well, when it's applied to the ancient world, it doesn't have to be modern. No, the empire had to be one, because that's, big, it's better. No, it was actually a pretty clever choice. When you split the empire, you can administrate it from your own perspective, and what we see from the Middle Ages, for instance, as an overall picture, is that it's political fragmentation that brought to every single place to build its own fortresses, its own army, its own administration, therefore to care about the local resources in a much more careful way than what would have done a huge empire with an only center that sucked all the resources indiscriminately from everywhere. So actually splitting the empire was a pretty clever choice. It was also dictated by evident physical problems. The fact that having a that the empire was under attack under several from several directions. So shifting armies from one side to the other all the time was extremely expensive, extremely costly. Now the empire strategical interests were mainly defensive. Another big myth is, why did Hadrian stop the expansion of the empire? The empire should have kept expanding. Yes, to crumble. You can't overstretch an empire. They didn't have the technology to control it at that point. They didn't have the resources in the first place. Well, this is exactly what happened in part even later, and it turns out that the empire kept going on, especially in the East, as we have seen. The bases were actually pretty solid. I mean, take how many sieges Constantinople absorbed before falling to the Turks, like to the Ottoman, to the artillery of the Ottoman Turks back in, ahead in the 15th century. Constantinople itself was a bulwark against which waves and waves and waves of peoples crushed for a millennium, and that was created in the 4th century. So where's this decline exactly? Where? It doesn't sound quite the same. Okay, of course, yes, there were losses, massive territorial losses. These are environmentally explainable. This is the other big topic that we have discussed many times. We can't definitely explain every every massive historical change with things like climate, but it's given by relatively clear at this point that for whichever reason it occurred, by the 6th century, fundamentally, there was a major economical, demographic shrinking of the whole Eurasian continent. So this has nothing to do with the empire in itself. It has eventually to do with some broader structural, statal, environmental reason. Whether it was the plague, whether it was the climate, we don't know, but we know that the fall happened. Of course, the decline of the empire brought in part to this insecurity, to this greater, but it doesn't explain in itself at all the shrinking. Even the massacres that we think, during the fall of the Roman Empire was violent. And we know it. Well, this is actually difficult to assert, because it was definitely a violent period, and we know it. We know definitely the Romans kept butchering each other for centuries, and that didn't help them at all. Actually, that's probably the most important structural factor that brought Rome down, even endemically, etc., and economically. But it can't explain literally everything. This was happening, by the way, also in other countries. As we were saying before, the Germans weren't any better. They were migrating exactly for this reason. They were migrating because the places where they lived couldn't sustain them anymore for some reason. And that's not because the Romans had invaded them, which they didn't for centuries sometimes. So there was a big problem there. Whichever it was, that went far beyond the borders of the empire in itself. So you can't attribute it to some internal choice. Less resources mean less wealth, less men for the army. So this means that the less people you have, the more it's difficult to control the territory. And if you have especially someone who is migrating en masse from the Eurasian steppes into your own territory, is that you have an additional problem, because you are weaker to stop them. These people can fill into the gaps, they can occupy certain lands. You literally don't have any troop to fight against. Because let's remember that the major losses of territory of the empire weren't actually due to direct conquest. Like that, because the Romans lost a battle. Sometimes they actually settled themselves, these peoples there, not because they were doing it for fun, but they wish they hadn't had those problems. But sometimes it was literally more profitable for the Romans having someone settling there as a buffer state to stem even the push of other peoples than having that people as an enemy and not having the army to cope with. This other bullshit that the Roman army was weaker in the late Roman Empire is probably one of the greatest myths ever. The Roman army was a first order all the time, as long as there was a Roman state, even in the West. The Roman army was the best. The problem was having a state, was having the resources to translate into an army. So you can't say that the fall of the Roman Empire was due to a decline of its inherent quality. It was really a big structural collapse that brought to lack of resources. And it's not easy to identify the causes overall, because we know them all together, but we don't have an actual scientific evidence to measure them. Like to say, okay, climate change influenced, I don't know, 40%, barbarian invasions 20%. We don't have anything like that. We don't have the historical data, so that's why you can't actually be so categorical about this, because we don't know. Most likely we will never know. So you see many problems, many interpretations that at the end of the day have to do with that you lean towards to, because you get used to them, you find them kind of interesting, they kind of work logically, but you miss the relation with reality, because we don't have it. We don't know. During the 19th century, the attention to these economical aspects was kind of also increasing. Socio-economical sciences were kind of developing. There were certain historians that were introducing this new knowledge into their work, and therefore they were starting observing that there is not just political military stuff. There is also society. There is also economics. That they're all intermingled. They're all intertwined. Marx had some importance in spreading these ideas, because Marx, I'm definitely ferociously anti-Marxist, but if you read Marx, there are a bunch of things he got that they're kind of acceptable. That's how they're normally, that they're actually part of classic economy. It's not that everything he wrote was just about communism, etc. There was some. No, he was a smart man, and also historical awareness, and his influence comes mostly about in explaining the reasons of the fall is a sort of social and productive transformation. That's so fundamentally the shifting from slavery, an economical system chiefly based on slavery, which is kind of also not really true, in my opinion. I'll explain you why. And to one founded on serfdom and feudal relations. That this is a very simplistic, interpretation. It kind of makes sense overall, because it is true that if you isolate slavery and serfdom, ancient slavery and medieval serfdom and vassalic relations, you see that, there's been a shift. There's been an actual change. The problem is that it's not necessarily all about that. First of all, it's kind of true, because slavery was at the base of Roman economy, but still the base of economy, truly speaking, was agriculture. Now, it's true, the majority of peasants were slaves in the sense that they worked for someone else, but even on this we can definitely debate, because when are we talking about? There were also a lot of free peasants. Also, what kind of economy we're talking, because latifundia weren't really everywhere in the same way. There were lots of free peasants, etc. But Marx in this was kind of interesting, because where he understood the phase of change, and in fact the evidence that that slavery at this point was transforming in some other thing. Actually, slavery survived the late Antiquity. You can't find legitimately slaves for real even in Carolingian Europe and beyond. Also, it's kind of difficult to distinguish slavery from serfdom sometimes, because it also depends on the conditions of what you do. There were definitely slaves in the Roman Empire, a few of them that were lucky enough to be treated like serfs, like the slaves that worked in the imperial domus in Rome were kind of educated people that were well fed, were well treated, because they were an investment. They weren't like the slaves of the work in Latifundia that were like kind of like concentration camps, for real. So the transformation derived mostly actually from a juridical point of view, because the Romans, like most of slavery-based society, actually had the system, the praxis to free, to emancipate slaves. And this is what normally happened, especially with the end of the wars of conquest. Many Roman many slaves actually turned out, they were freed over generations, and it's difficult to tell how this affected directly the economy, because there are many other factors that intervene, but that brought to massive social changes in many ways that weren't actually much of a bettering of slavery, which still kind of existed, but also worsening of the middle classes conditions that were turning to colonists. Read something very close to serfs. We'll talk about this in Social Transformations of the West. I think it's the title of the video, if I'm not wrong. In the first 30 years of the 20th century, there were new works that contributed to widen perspectives on this phase of change. The positions started to differentiate, chiefly at the beginning from the art historians, because those were the ones who, the history of art sometimes is, they started to see from Constantine onwards, so from this kind of further glorification of the Eastern Roman monarchy and its forms, etc. Think about the Byzantine mosaics, all this idea of light, of gold. It's something kind of cool, because it's kind of cool to look at Byzantine art. It's very bright, it's very rich, etc. So that's what caught mostly the attention. Obviously, behind that luxus and behind that richness, there was the sweat and tears and of many that were working for that pretty harshly. So just remember that when you see something beautiful and expensive, doesn't necessarily mean that it's that comes necessarily from a happy society. Some does, some doesn't. It really depends what's behind that. But they think about Regal, for instance, that studied the improvements in art and this concentration of resources, because that's fundamentally what it was. The idea that the progressive monarchization of the Roman state, the Roman politics, brought definitely to the concentration of more wealth in the hands of fewer people. So definitely these fewer people spend lots of money to celebrate themselves, also politically, etc., which is something that when you have actually many freemen, many middle class persons that actually don't give a damn about glorifying themselves, you can't see. So that's a brilliant example. It's as if a modern politician who is a billionaire starts making starts picturing himself everywhere looking cool, etc., and you say, oh wow, he looks cool. Yeah, but you normal middle class people don't do that, and yet that's kind of better whether in fact there are more middle class people like that than one than not. So when these ostentations start to happen, especially in this context, historically speaking, it's not because the whole society was better off. Like, it was actually the contrary. There was a overall impoverishment. There was an overall crisis. The historians of economy, like Dobsch or Pirenne, started formulating these other theories under the economical point of view. They started to discuss the weight of the monetary component, and also of nature, of the environment in the ancient economy, into starting to calculate certain cesure based on this distinction, derived from this distinction, sometimes being completely wrong. Like Pirenne, Pirenne's thesis wanted that it was the Arabs who consistently broke the wealth of the ancient world. They put an end to the ancient world, because he was looking at things like vases that were transported from Marseille to Constantinople in the 6th century, at the beginning of the 7th century, before the Arab invasion, and saying, oh look, there was still a Mediterranean trade, and after the Arabs there is not. Well, this is false, because first of all, the Mediterranean trade that he was measuring was still pretty much contracted and shrunk in size and in volume of traffics since many years. So you can't take the volume of traffics that existed in the 2nd century and pretending it was the same as the one of the 7th century. It was obviously, the one of the 7th was much smaller. Secondly, the Arabs didn't bring at all to any stop of trade. If anything, actually, after the first moment of political fracture in the Mediterranean, they actually favored the economical growth, even of Europe in itself. When eventually the Europeans earned so many gold from these trades that they surpassed the Muslims with a trade balance and went getting once again the upper hand in Mediterranean. So this is not really, and they were using Arab gold fundamentally. So this is particularly meaningful to show you how this was not. But these theories, however, were kind of giving a positive role to late antique times, even overemphasizing its importance in this sense, its prosperity, let's say, and also creating problems in terms of what came next, or at least its perception, because if you think that what happens after the Arab invasions is just darkness, you haven't understood much of the early medieval times. And but so it is. So even the perceptions of late antiquity came to affect powerfully the way even the Middle Ages were conceived. There were other theories, complex interpretations, like the ones of Mikhail Rostovtsev, I don't know whether I pronounced it correctly, in 1926, that also in here didn't quite abandon the idea of decadence, but it didn't operate these simplifying equivalencies that characterized the previous historiography. For instance, in Rostovtsev, the barbarization was seen in new ways, because before it was believed that it was the barbarization of the Roman Empire that brought to its end, which is false, because the Roman Empire was de facto actually never barbarized. Also, this myth that the barbarians took over even in the Roman army, the Roman army was Germanized. It's not true. It was the Germans who got Romanized in the Roman army, which is very, very different. And that's the accurate perspective. When we talk about the Germanization, we don't see it, because either they were federati, that means they were literally foreigners that stayed somewhere else, that weren't part of the Roman army, they were just mercenaries or people who were fighting on behalf of the Romans somewhere else. But if you look at the numbers of the Roman army, actually the number of Germans became difficult to control only in the years right after Adrianople, but eventually was pretty much reabsorbed. And even if there were many Germans that came later, they weren't a problem. They were kind of diluted in part, and they still were kind of faithful to Rome. So what was the deal with that? They became Romans themselves. So in Rostov you have a different approach that actually insisted on the sort of barbarization of the Roman of the Roman ruling classes that were not capable of reacting to peasant pressure, which is kind of a bit of a controversial idea. That is a bit true only if you take into consideration how the Germanic model of leadership was, but it's not that the Romans ever bought it. Fundamentally, early medieval Europe was Germanized in the sense that the local social structures were under the Germanic domination and not at all times actually, and not in all places, were kind of democratized. I mean, it's a bad term, but in the sense that wherever the Roman latifundia died, the middle class freeman model kicked in, even among the Latin population. So this didn't happen everywhere. Actually, there were large areas of Gaul, of Spain, that were where the estates were maintained in their kind of Roman fashion. I mean, even in there that they kind of shrank sometimes, but that's where the model kind of remained unaltered. In other areas, it was kind of different. In places like Britain, like Italy, like in other areas of the Roman of the former Western Roman Empire, like maybe northern Spain or the Danubian area, kind of, yeah, it was more like that. But at that point, you can't talk about a Germanization of Roman elites that brought. I mean, it's very complex. There was definitely an hybrid between the two things, but it didn't correspond to this emergence of peasant culture. Like, take Gaul. Into Gaul, the Gallo-Roman senatorial elite became an hybrid together with the Germanic elite, but that didn't bring to the rise of peasants at all. At least it remained a very highly stratified society with an aristocracy that from Roman times passed into early, remained unaltered in the formulas generally. With all the modifications in terms of course, the ruralization and militarization and all, but fundamentally we're still very large landowners, very powerful landowners, and the peasantry was kind of colonists. That's it. During the 60s and the 70s of the 20th century, there was a further step with Cameron chiefly, and the historians started to study the late Antiquity as a sort of an autonomous period. So this was an important step, in my opinion, because it's kind of more logical in some ways. I mean, it's not that the importance of the previous and following times is can't be understood without the late Antiquity, but it was being observed that this late Antiquity is a pretty long time. I mean, it's like, in fact, between the 3rd and the 6th, sometimes even the 7th century. I mean, it's like kind of a very, very long time. So it's definitely a time you can get lost in, where there are so many changes, so many transformations, so many eras within it, in itself, that it's kind of more useful to look at it, to to conceive it a bit as a universe on its own, rightfully in some ways. This has also brought to a new attention to the East, because the East, as you remember before, if you take Gibbon, etc., was considered in part also the cause of moral decadence of the empire. Too bad that actually the empire remained and survived strong in the East. So there is something wrong in the equation. Definitely, there is a Western-centric perspective given by the most famous date of 476 AD, where, as we said, really nothing happened. I mean, people who lived in that period didn't actually, sense much of a break, of a fracture. Obviously, there was someone who was understanding how things were going, but there were also other important things going on, and it de facto it didn't change much. Things had already changed from centuries in many ways, and now they were also keeping to change, but that date is nothing extremely important, actually. There were way more important dates that in fact happen in the East, but also in the West, that are kind of underestimated. And even in this perspective, it's being reduced also. Another stereotype is being reduced, the one of a sort of Eastern idleness or stability that was contraposed to massive and sudden changes in the West. Because objectively, even the Eastern Roman Empire underwent sensible changes during this time. Constantine started it, but it aside from obviously being their pre-existent civilization and bases, etc., those were the wealthiest, at least the richest areas of the empire in some ways. The Mediterranean, these kept evolving. I mean, there is a huge difference between empires like the one of Constantine, the one of Theodosius, the one of Justinian, and they're also all pretty distant if you think about it. And the East also risked sometimes to be wiped out. It didn't make it because of a series of astonishing, impressive characteristics. I made a video, if you go into the Byzantine history playlist, that deals with this, how and why, what were the features, the characteristics that made the Eastern Roman Empire kind of surviving in many ways and remaining in standing, etc. Well, and also in the West, if you think about it, the Western history was in many ways less dynamic than what it seems. It's not that there was this major wave of populations like in 406. There was this progressive shrinking of the Roman control over the Western provinces, but there weren't many sudden changes that the East was way more exposed. I mean, even if you take the Eastern frontier was kind of much more turbulent than the Western one. The West simply came to be to round out the resources more than else. So to suffer, let's say, more of this kind of smaller events that were taking place in there, and simply giving room to them and to develop, and so that's more or less how it happened. So it's been rightfully pointed out that this catastrophism that we mostly attached to the western half of the empire wasn't actually a big deal. And this is particularly important because we often forget that the Roman Empire was a sort of Hellenistic empire at this point, at least. So that even the western provinces had already lost a great importance compared to the eastern one before even before the 3rd century crisis. I mean, that was kind of an evident process. It's obvious that Western Europeans, I mean, our Western European historiographers wanted to look at from our own perspective. Like, okay, we are in the West now, so what happened back then, it is kind of has more importance to what happened in the East. But that's a very kind of modern prejudice. We have to accept that large areas of what is today Western Europe were actually also the least developed of the empire. I mean, places like Britain, like northern Gaul, northern Spain, well, even northern Italy in part, or the Danubian area, they weren't actually pretty developed worlds. The great Roman civilization was chiefly a Mediterranean civilization. And therefore, it's not even so impressive that the West at that time didn't have so many resources to cope with certain migrations like the one of the Germans on the Rhine River, on the Rhine border, and all this stuff. So the East in itself had millenary traditions of civilization that, in a certain sense, the Romans had just come to rule over, and that eventually were kind of absorbed themselves by. So you don't have much of a Easternization of the West, in my opinion. Is too much emphasized, but just the fact that the West remained kind of West for what it was, and it even had reasons to. Another thing that is often also overlooked is that large areas, especially the ones that I mentioned before, now as the least developed of the empire, were tendentially not very supportive of the Roman government. I mean, it is true that, of course, I don't want to reduce at all the deep Romanization of areas like of Spain, of Gaul, of Italy, of course, but also places like the Rhine Valley, parts of Britain, etc. But still, when the Romans went away, you realize there were kind of other people that had remained always there, the local communities that the empire had ruled on, that kind of took their own. Think about the Bagaudae, or the Bagaudae, how you want to call them. Those were people that, even remaining territorially, at least namely, under the Roman Empire for things like half of a millennium, hadn't quite much Romanized. This is also another consistent aspect. I mean, obviously they were kind of a product of the Roman Empire, but still they were largely at least the rural populations. It's not that they cared so much about who was in charge. That was a survival rate economy. That they just cared about surviving over the centuries. What did they care about the Roman Empire in itself, if not for the fact that they had soldiers and then you had to pay taxes to them? It's it. Obviously, Romanization made miracles, but this Romanization was mostly political in terms of elites most of the times. That was the great inclusiveness of the Romans, but it's not that the Romans cared much about their subjects. I mean, as long as they were Roman citizens, that was important for them. But during this time, also the civic values were kind of, citizenship was kind of meaningless. Now we're not talking about citizens, but about subjects. In fact, even when you were a Roman, a full Roman, and this went in parallel also with impoverishment of the middle classes, and that's why, in part, and this is very often overlooked, many of these of the peasantry actually sided with the Germans at some point, but not because they were Germans against the Romans, nothing like that, but simply because the Germans brought a different social model that was kind of more appealing for a impoverished individual than what the one of the Roman senatorial latifundists wished. So this is very complex, but it's still a factor to take into consideration. So meaning that the East remained more consistently Roman or Hellenistic, at least, so that, for instance, even urbanism was kind of more, at least it lived, it was more intense at this time than in Western Europe. Then, paradoxically, during the Middle Ages, it's Europe that rises as a major urban society sometimes. I mean, not sometimes, but, from a certain time onwards. While the other urban centers in places like the Near East and the Byzantine world kind of didn't make it to expand. Also because of autocratic rule in part, but it's not really only about that. So they are kind of different worlds. They also speak different languages because, let's be honest, the empire this time still had Latin, which is like its official language, but most of its subjects at this very time spoke Greek, because half of the empire was kind of more populated. Greek was the normal coinage that they spoke. They made more mass in this sense, while the West was also more depopulated. Latin was spoken chiefly definitely into Italy, also in these more Romanized areas, let's say, and in fact even in places like Gaul, that was Celtic originally, kind of a Romance language remained. But also the majority of the population, presumably at this time, didn't actually speak Latin, or at least there were wild, aside, Celtic was definitely spoken. Now German was brought in as well. So whatever they spoke was something that was already different from what was spoken into Italy, for instance. So it's notorious, actually, that even in these provinces that maintained Romance languages, like what would be today's France, Spain, Portugal, Romania, etc., those are places where actually they began to speak a Latin that wasn't quite the Latin spoke in Rome, but the Latin spoke by the soldiers of the early empire. They were largely Italic more than strictly Latin. The Latins were Italic, but they were confined to the area around Rome, and this time they actually didn't serve in the army pretty much. So these Italic people actually spoke very different way. For instance, this ending S that you find in Iberian languages, etc., you don't find it in Italian. That's something that similarly comes from the Italic people surrounding Rome in the peninsula that were not Romans, that they didn't spoke actually Latin, but a similar language that was still Italic, but it was in fact different. So, or just think about the differentiations. It is true that Rome had actually Latinized many places. Also, we should get rid of the preconception that Celtic was a much different language from the Italic ones. Actually, Celtic language is very, very close to Latin. So also this thing is that, but Rome had Latinized effectively a lot, and many languages during the Roman Empire kind of disappeared because of this. Not because the Romans caused a cultural genocide, as some detractors of Roman culture really would like to express very, very naively, but simply because people stopped talking them, because it wasn't useful for them anymore. They had this massive system, the spoke Latin was kind of easier, and that's the reason why today, for instance, our respective languages are getting anglicized. It's not because, I don't know, the United States or the United Kingdom caused a cultural ethnocide. It's because we find it more useful to speak. So these stupid interpretations kind of leave the time that they found. But I would say that there are naturally also other parts of history that are consistently neglected, seriously neglected. There are the ones expressed by archaeology. History is kind of closer, it's because it's written, because you can see the person kind of behind the thought, the idea. Archaeology is a bit more faceless, but at the same time it's very, very important because it's still living. It's way more human and I mean warmly human that we can think. And archaeology has showed us so many data that are to be understood, and there is so much to find anymore. Like, especially for ancient times, we can say that we have almost exhausted the historiographical sources that there were to find, that had survived. Archaeology is still to expand. Unfortunately, archaeology also costs a lot for obvious reasons. Nevertheless, archaeology offers us so much, and in terms of late antiquity, it tended to stress, especially in certain areas, let's say that it kind of supported the theory of a greater continuity in Roman structures than what we have actually depicted, especially in the cities. This is particularly important because it makes you understand that also the big crack, the big collapse actually didn't exist even from a structural point of view. There was no sudden end, there was no sudden break, there was no sudden destruction. During late antiquity, most of the people actually kept living, or even if there was a transformation, it kept happening in the same haven of the Roman civilization in many ways. And this also has, I must say that in many ways there has been also a view of late antiquity and of the same Middle Ages that has been very much grounded on from a kind of a Northern European perspective. I mean, it's obvious that historiographies such as the British one always kind of looked at the thing from that had such a big echo in Western cultural and historical awareness. Think about Gibbon himself. It kind of looked from the the northwesternmost area of the empire. From that perspective, it also had less. There was less urbanized, less Latinized. So a perspective that tended to stress, even for medieval times, this idea that those pictures of the north didn't quite match with the ones of the Mediterranean, right? So even stories, the history of this period has been told from perspectives that can be very limited to a certain particular context, and therefore there is a need to expand the perspective, and this also happens linguistically speaking. For instance, a very few people know Latin today, which is dramatic because I can't understand how a person can study ancient history of medieval history without knowing Latin. I mean, yeah, okay, you can study archaeology. Even in the Middle Ages, it's full of vernacular language. But also in here, you can't ignore that because it's still the largest production ever of sources. It's been written either in Greek or in Latin. And if you don't know them, it's kind of like, what the hell? Okay, of course, if you want to study, I don't know, Vandal culture Sweden from the 7th century, well, okay, maybe you don't necessarily need Latin. Well, not really, because still most of what we know about the general context of Europe at this time comes from Latin sources that in the West were the only ones being written, together with Greek sources, of course. But it's impossible, and sometimes you find this kind of weird reactionary. a kind of isolationist reactionaries that are mostly also nationalistically fueled by saying, we don't have to study the Romans, there were also other histories. Yeah, okay, but the Romans still produced a freaking lot, and most of we know also about what we know about other peoples comes from the Roman source. So it's you can't do without it. And this is valid, however, for also whoever speaks Latin, because generally speaking, of Western historiography has been solidly anchored up to this point to Latin sources. I mean, still Latin is fortunately known, at least in academies, more or less, by the way, because I've seen that the last generations, my peers, the knowledge of Latin is disgusting. It's non-existent, actually, and it's shocking for me, at least. But this is valid in fact with, for instance, I don't know ancient Greek myself. I've never studied ancient Greek, so I kind of understand it because I mean, if you are a Westerner, if you have read something. I mean, when I was a kid, I liked not in Greek, but I got used to the idea that there was a Greek world, that our etymologies largely come from the Greek world, in part in our vocabulary, etc. So you have to learn them. And I personally love etymologies, so I kind of got acquainted to Greek. I know something in ancient Greek, actually, but I can't translate directly a text from Greek. But I kind of can. If I have a vocabulary, I can figure out something because I approached it sometimes. But also in there, I think I miss it. I personally study mostly the Latin West, and it's kind of... But I know some German, for instance, so I also expand. I know some English, at least. I hope to know some English. So I have an understanding in part of also the Germanic world. So when it comes to medieval history, I stopped mostly to the Latin Germanic world. I'm fine with that. I can understand it. But if you want to study late antiquity well, I think it's fundamental to know, besides Latin and Greek, without which you can't go anywhere, literally, we should know languages like Syriac. You should know Aramaic, for instance, because otherwise, can you study? And I would say that aside from this, it's the even broader geographical perspective that is kind of ignored. I mean, just make an experiment now. I tell you, picture yourself in mind the Roman Empire, geographically speaking. Well, I would like to know from you, how many of you pictured the empire just as a unique thing with nothing around, and how many of you actually pictured the empire as contextualized into a broader world? Like even with Africa, with Asia, with the rest of Europe that was not conquered by the Romans. That's important. So, for instance, the history of places like Scandinavia, like Nubia, like Yemen, those are fundamental, even to understand late antiquity. I mean, just think about the Germans. Those mostly came from Scandinavia. It was all their roots, their myths, etc. They perceived themselves as coming from there. Nubia was so important. Think about the Coptic Church, all the relations that existed with the Sassanid Empire through the Arabian Peninsula, and with Yemen, for instance. Yemen had an enormous civilization. Southwest Arabia was the cradle of great civilization, with the Sabbans, with all the stuff. Those were pretty active areas, and people will say, "But what's Nubia? What's Yemen?" Well, how can you study late antiquity if you don't know these countries? If you don't know Scandinavia? If you don't look at others? So that's pretty meaningful, in my opinion. And this reveals, it's interesting that studies have kind of shed more light on these places, but there is definitely so much more to learn about them. and even these geographical areas. I mentioned Scandinavia, Nubia, and Yemen because these are areas that I could extend it to. I don't know, to the Baltic, which is still Scandinavia in part, but I'm talking about lands like today's Russia up to the Urals, or even beyond. If you look at places like, let's leave aside the Sassanid Empire in Iran, but Transoxiana, like today's Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and places like those are kind of important because these are particularly important to show you different rhythms of evolution. I mean, most of us think about late antiquity in a wholly Roman function, right? I mean, there was the empire, that's like kind of the biggest thing. That's what you want to stay focused on, and it's legitimate. But when you look at other areas that were kind of outside of it, because at this point, areas like Scandinavia, Nubia, and Yemen had consistent contacts with the Roman Empire, but they weren't quite directly attached to it. And you see that they had different developments that kind of do not match with the Roman Empire in all the evolution, that have also very slow transformation. The same goes, however, also with the same provinces of the Roman Empire. This is also relatively, I don't know how much is still done, in the sense that, let's study what was happening into Thrace, and let's compare it to what was happening in Rhaetia, let's say. And that's also important to show you that even within the Roman Empire there were different systems that were dwelling on their own. So, yeah. And so I think the times are kind of right now to start a new reflection on the Roman Empire, on this period of transition. I don't want to say the end of the empire, of the end of the ancient world, but trying to compare, making an analysis of what was happening at the same time in the Roman Empire, also with other places in the world. This is particularly important, so that you can effectively measure what was changing and what was instead remaining kind of the same. So, there would be a lot to add, and I promise we will talk about lots of other things, the splitting between East and West, the 4th century reforms, the empire during the 3rd century. There's a lot to talk about the late antiquity, but we can't now, so we will do it another time. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.